approximately quarterly Teal Team bonfire. We're very, very excited today to have a conversation with a member of the DAO community who is going to give us insight into how Teal may be popping up in places like Web3. First, here is a quick agenda. We're going to do a quick Teal primer, and we're going to also have a quick get to know you. We'll do some breakouts and put you all in a little situation to get into the topic of the day. We'll have that conversation with our guest, Zach Anderson. He's going to be telling us again about DAOs and Teal. We'll do a Q&A with him, and then we want to have y'all answer a few questions about how you think we might be able to apply the technology that Zach is going to talk us through in your world and how to make it even more teal. With that, I'd love to ground us here today with a quick poem by our friend Rumi, and it's called The Guest House. This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival. A joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. If that's not whole, I don't know what is. So now I would like to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Matt, and he will talk through these pillars, get us centered on them so that we can be all teal-minded as we enter into this discussion.
Hey, everybody. I love the idea of being centered on your pillar, because if you're not, you're gonna fall over, right? So just so we're all on the same slide or page, when we talk about holism, or when we talk about teal, we really focus on three pillars. We look at holism as the first among equals, the center pillar, and it's really the people can truly participate as their real self. When all styles, identities, and demographics are welcome, then you're able to unlock the other parts of teal. The next part that follows with that is evolutionary purpose. Once you're able to be your whole self, you can tap into your purpose and your purpose as it evolves. Purpose for the individual and purpose for the organization, and hopefully get those things aligned. And once we get the group fully engaged, fully aligned with their purpose, then we can tap into self-management, where people are free to fully contribute and fully engage with each other in a way that shares power and makes everybody a vital part of a community, as opposed to a family or a pyramid or other metaphors that we've used in the past to talk about organizations. So those are the things we're going to be touching on. And clearly today, a lot of what we'll talk about is self-management, but these things are all of a part or a piece. So we'll definitely tap into holism and purpose as well when we talk about DAOs. So now we're going to have a little breakout time. So 10 minutes, we're going to talk about how are your contributions seen and rewarded at work? And would you like this to change? And if so, how? Feel free to maybe push a little bit, be a little bit vulnerable. You don't have to expose all of yourself, but maybe 10% more than you might be comfortable normally with a stranger. Stephanie's going to pop us into breakout rooms, and we'll come back in 10 minutes.
We'll start moving forward, everyone, because we have a very, very exciting discussion to have with Zach Anderson. Zach and I were introduced by our very dear friend, Moshe. It was the first time that I had really even thought about the world of distributed autonomous organizations. I don't think I even knew what DAO stood for at that moment. This universe has been very slowly and interestingly revealed to me and to the Teal team through our now connection with and discussions with both Moshe and Zach about Coordinate. So we wanted to open this world a little bit to our broader community. which is why we invited Zach to speak to all of us here today and share about his journey and about the journey that Coordinate, his company, is taking. So, Zach.
Great. Let's get that headshot off the screen. Time for a new one. Hello, everybody. Great to meet y'all and see some especially friendly faces. Yeah, so I'll share a little bit about my background, and then I will share a little bit just about DAOs and how I see them intersecting with Teal, but also just DAOs generally. And then I'll share a little bit more deeply about my project, our project, which is called Coordinate. And it especially, I think, as Matt alluded to, is focused on, I'd say, the self-management and holism, especially if we look at it from a Teal perspective. So yeah, really quickly, my story is that my career has been, when you could call it a career, I spent my 20s basically traveling and staying on farms and just traveling and living as cheap as I could. And then it was time to actually do something, and I went to business school, and then I went and got a sustainability degree. So sustainability kind of writ large was always something that I was really interested in and felt like was something really worth dedicating time to. And so I spent, I don't know, 7 years, I guess, as a sustainability consultant. And this was working with Fortune 50 companies around sustainability strategy and communications. So working with Apple and Dell and Intel and their tier 1 suppliers on how can we increase adoption of social standards in our supply chain, things like that. And what I found is that people, one, everything that requires, real change is obviously, it's a systemic kind of change, and this requires deep collaboration. And people love the idea of collaboration, but they actually are really bad at collaborating. And this I got really interested in, and this was also the time I got introduced to spiral dynamics and integral theory as sort of frameworks. And I just got really interested in why is it that some people can work together and some people can't, and where do worldviews come from? And so went down that rabbit hole and ended up co-founding a consultancy called Converge. And Converge was all about impact networks. So we would design and launch impacts for social and environmental initiatives. Largely like institutional philanthropy would hire us to bring 50 stakeholders together to steward 500,000 acres of redwoods. And so we would bring together logging CEO and the tribes and CAL FIRE and state parks and all of these landholders that have a stake in things. And we'd have intensive retreats with them to sort of figure out, like, what are our shared values here? When we say stewardship, what do we mean? And where are the places where we actually have a starting place to interact and collaborate from? One of the novel things that we did at Converge is the way that we paid each other is that no one was on payroll in that organization. We just would form together in teams. It was a very network kind of approach. And then the teams that formed would do the work, and we would put the money from an invoice from a client in the middle of the table and have a conversation. And I actually, in my breakout just now, Travis was saying that this has even a practice. It's called the good money story. We called it Thunderdome, like, affectionately, because thought we were going to be, fighting over who would get what, but it turned out to be, much more generative than that, and people generally, like, really wanting to give to thank their colleagues. And so around the time that we were in the thick of COVID and I was just done facilitating things online, I'm sure none of you can relate to that experience. So I decided to take a little sabbatical, and then that's when I sort of discovered DAOs and Web3. And DAOs, to me, were really the way that we could scale our work at Converge. Like, this is infrastructure for people around the world who care about something to start to organize and collaborate and coordinate at what they're doing. And so, Coordinate, which I'll share, is a way for people essentially to do that process of how do we, instead of having some single entity or single black box deciding who's going to get paid what, we all decide together and can allocate budgets according to the value that we've experienced people adding. But before I dive into Coordinape and share a little bit more about it, and yes, like big +1 to any questions at any time, please interrupt. The more conversational, the better. But just to give a quick primer on DAOs, and maybe I can't see everyone at once, but just how many people are at least, would you say, are elementary familiar when you hear DAO, kind of what that means and what it's pointing to? All right, so most people have a general idea, and you can find 1,000 definitions for DAO online. I feel like saying DAO is kind of like saying company. It's like, well, there's a lot of different, there's a lot of spectrum in there. But generally, how I would think about DAOs is it's kind of a global bat signal that somebody says, here's what we're trying to do, here's what we're about. It could be a mission, it could be a real evolutionary purpose, it could be just a vibe that people are into. People over here are doing stuff like us. But there's some initial spark that says, this is what this DAO is about. And the other thing that makes it really unique is governance. And so the autonomous part of the distributed autonomous organization, that autonomous part is really about governance and decision making, and making rules that are enforceable in code by smart contracts. And that basically means that you don't have you can have bylaws and things like that, but they can always be changed. And instead, this is governance that is held on the blockchain, so you know how it's going to work. And if it's ever changed, you also know exactly who changed it and how. So it really just adds a large degree of transparency. And I think it's interesting. I think Ed the Greater asked in our breakout, like, when was the first DAO? And I really should know the year, but I believe it was 2017. Where this term DAO came from was the DAO, the first one. And it really was an attempt to create a fully autonomous organization that just ran on smart contracts. And it was essentially like a group investment sort of vehicle. It was hacked. They lost over $100 million in Ether. And that turned out to be, we don't have to go down that rabbit hole, but the entire Ethereum blockchain ended up evolving because of this thing. But I think what's interesting, especially for this group, and for folks like me in DAOs, is that the sort of DNA of the DAO is this autonomous, like it's written in code. And in many ways, there's sort of this kind of, software development ethos of like pesky, irrational people. People are messy. Like, how can we make an autonomous organization that runs on code, and code is law? And that was really kind of, I think, an unspoken ethos until recently. And we've had a lot more diverse folks showing up in this Web3 space, and especially in the DAO space, and thinking about things from this organizational context. So DAOs over the past, especially 2 years, have really proliferated. And DAOs can be everything from, there's kind of a joke, like it's a group of internet friends with a shared bank account. And there are DAOs that are doing really interesting things there. There's a DAO called Nouns. And essentially every day they sell one image and a noun, and then that money goes in a shared treasury, and anyone can make a proposal for how that money in that treasury should be spent. And so, they now have close to $40 million, and, there are people proposing all sorts of things, like, what should we do to further this Nouns project? And then, so there's also a public Nouns. So an offshoot of that project has started, and it already has about $200,000 worth of Ether in its treasury. And the same thing. So this is a very simple version of a DAO, right? People just coming together and saying, I want to be part of this, organization or this group, or I like I like what they're doing. I'm going to join it. I pay something to join it potentially, or some contribution allows me to join it, and I find my way from there. And then you have DAOs that are I would say much more sophisticated on the other end. Things like MakerDAO that's been around for a long time, and I won't get into too much what they do, but because it's really complicated. But they work on monetary policy. They have their own stable coin, so a token that doesn't move in value. It's pegged to $1, and they're really involved in the decentralized finance space. But this is a DAO that has hundreds of full-time people working at it, with the struggles that go along with any organization of that size. So you kind of have this huge spectrum. Like I said, much like a company can be, Google, or it can be a mom and pop. DAOs kind of are all these different kinds of flavors that we're seeing, and arising with. I think that the interesting thing for us is to look at, like, why are DAOs so compelling for people to join, and why would they want to? And I think they attract folks that are internet native, right? So all of this is happening online. And so back to that bat signal metaphor, that's what I really think of. You can say, this is what we're doing here. This is what we're into. I'm a part of Cabin DAO, for example, and Cabin DAO is trying to build the world's first decentralized city. So they're building or sort of initiating neighborhoods all over the world. And these are like retreat centers or co-living places. And there's people all over the world that have this dream of living in more community. And so they join Cabin DAO and they meet other folks who have similar projects, and they share learnings. And these are how networks grow. And so I think that digital native that's very comfortable showing up in a chat room and saying, hey, everybody, and finding where the other channels are that they want to talk about, and just kind of dive in. It really encourages it. You can kind of get involved right away, right? And this is the other part of DAOs that I think is really interesting. And it's relevant also when I start sharing about Coordinate, is that DAOs most of them have a very porous border. I can't walk up to Google and say, like, hey, I thought of this neat idea. Like, can I find some developers? Like, anyone want to work on this? But that's what happens at DAOs. People can show up with a proposal and say, like, hey, what if we did this? This would be an awesome idea. And if they have a really good proposal, if they have an effective way to do it, and the community, because of that governance structure that I mentioned, so there's a clear governance structure of how to pass a proposal, and they get it passed, someone can get their idea funded right away. They can be working on it if it's a good idea right away. So this obviously both increases kind of the chaos factor in DAOs, because there's all sorts of people proposing things and arguing about whether that's been proposed or not. But it also creates a huge amount of creativity and innovation for people to try things, for people to collaborate on things. And so I think those things, and then that combined with sort of the overall mania that was created through in crypto over the last 2 years, obviously brought a lot of people as well. Just there's energy here. There's something happening here. A lot of people were obviously speculating and trying to make money as well. But I try to really make a clear distinction when you hear crypto. And cryptocurrencies and trading and things like that are very different from DAOs and this kind of fundamental blockchain technology. So it's important not to get those things confused. I guess the last thing I'll say, and then if there's any specific questions about DAOs that I can answer, is that we are part of this movement of DAO infrastructure, right? So all of these people are very excited about DAOs and the things that we can do with collectives that are coming together and lending their talents. But how are we going to? There's still all the jobs to be done that corporations do, right? Everything from like, how do decisions get made? How are we paying people? How are we getting revenue? How does this thing actually live? And so there's been kind of an explosion of what's broadly called DAO tools. And this is everything from how do you, designate people's role on chain? How do you make payments on chain? For us, how do you actually decide who gets what? How do you verify decisions have been made? All these things. And so there's a huge stack of tools that are being created, project management tools that are Web3 native that interact with wallets. All of these things are kind of in an explosion right now, and we're really seeing, the analogy gets made often of kind of the early 90s internet, where the technology is definitely here to stay and going to be revolutionary, but there's a lot of experiments happening, and a lot of them, may or may not stand the test of time. But there's a whole lot of just innovation and learning and goofy stuff happening. So that's kind of my appraisal is sort of the state of the situation of DAOs right now. And before I talk about Coordinape specifically, just welcome any questions or comments folks have about DAOs.
Zach, I'll jump in with a question. The pesky people question, and as it relates to then also the infrastructure question, do you think there's room for openness to thinking about the more holistic elements of people working together as things are unfolding, where people are maybe realizing it's actually valuable to connect in at least face-to-face virtually or in person, to kind of not just rely on strict rules of code, but vibe, intuition, these kinds of things that can come from community.
Right. Overgeneralizing, like that's points to I feel like what is a cultural shift going on in Web3 broadly, is this sort of recognition that the roots of all of the technology that we use are in a very linear, I would say, a sort of linear masculine kind of mindset, and this idea that like, oh, we can just work on code, we can work on things online, and we don't have to actually have relationship or connection with folks. And sometimes that's true, some software is very modular, but I think we're seeing the limits of that, and people are getting interested in how do we incorporate more ways of knowing, right? Which is really hard when you're primarily using text-based communication. Yeah, how do we create more connection online and amongst each other? I was just at DevCon, which is a huge Ethereum conference, and we did a session on this, essentially on like, how do the human side of DAOs, and it was overflowing with people in and really, are being interested in that specific question. Like, how do we make sure we're bringing the people into all of these structures that are run by code and by software? So I think there's a growing awareness of how important that is. When you talk to people when you look at sort of the tools and a lot of the things that people are working on in DAOs, it's like, better project management software and better tracking for goals and KPIs and things like this. It has a sort of like, it feels a little bit like it's pursuing that corporate efficiency. But when you talk to people in DAOs, what the problem is, much like organizations, it's always like, well, this person's doing this and nobody knows they're doing that. And we were DMing and they said that, it's like, it's all people all the way down. And so that's one of the things we're really thinking about at Coordinape, is like, how can we introduce more of this humanity, and how can we, bring people out more and get them into connection, because we know that relationship is the fundamental unit of any successful collaboration. So that was pretty long-winded, but I think it's
Thank you.
I think that there's a cultural shift going on right now that's sort of like what was the realm of programmers and geeks is now bringing English majors like me, who's never written a line of code, into the space, and really maybe evolving is a little self-important word, but certainly like bringing new aspects to it. There was a DAO that I contributed to when I first got into the space, which was a DAO in the DeFi, or decentralized finance space. There were 40 full-time contributors all working together, and I was like, well, when's the next all hands call? Like, we've never had an all hands call. We've never talked to each other. It's like, okay, and like, what a waste of time. We did our first one, and they were like, that was amazing. Wow. I did, it's like these real simple things of just like starting to weave together connections and interpersonal things. We're not the norm, and I think we're seeing that slow kind of cultural shift.
It just like strikes me as you're talking, Zach, that there's like two ways to build trust, and one is through like repeatable systems like you find in technology or software or something that's dependable like that, and the other is through human connection. And it makes me wonder, on the spectrum of what DAOs are working on or what their mission or their purpose is, where does the human connection piece become absolutely pivotal? I'm asking this in part because as you were talking, I just like briefly went down the rabbit hole, admittedly, and I was like, oh, there's DAO fashion houses and all these things that are like not necessarily in the technology sector in a straightforward way, but in the creative space too. And so just that's sort of where my question is coming from.
Yeah, I mean, DAOs are not at all technology focused. They really offer people a way to come together. I mean, my guess is that DAOs that still exist in 3 years will have a regular cadence of meeting together 4 times per year. I think that'll just become like a very obvious best practice. I think the same thing is going to happen too for a lot of corporate folks, is they're going to realize they don't need an office, but they do need in-person touch time. And I think that retreat will be a much bigger thing than they are now, and they won't be called retreats, and it'll just be acknowledged that you sort of have your time together to really do that sense making and connecting as people and like just figuring out the hard stuff, and then you go execute on it for X amount of time. At Coordinate, we try to do like 5-month cadence, and at Coordinate at Converge, we did the same thing. It was really all remote with intensive retreats. I think is where most organizations will end up. Personally, I feel like at least ones that are doing creative and knowledge work and stuff like that. And there was the other thing that I feel like I forgot to mention about DAOs just real quickly is this. Absolutely. I think there's going to be a huge market for experienced designers. I forgot to mention, but to me, the kind of the fundamental innovation of DAOs that's allowed by the blockchain technology is the tokenization of value. So whereas before, for example, we may have a startup together, say we're starting a fashion brand, and we could say, well, I'm the founder, so I get 50%, and then the first employees get this percentage, and how long have you been there, and it's all by time, and you're sort of looking at these past templates of how does one start a company. Whereas a DAO, you can say you can mint tokens, and these tokens are decision-making power in the DAO. They're functionally ownership of it. And those can be distributed in all different ways. They can be allocated according to people's contribution. They can be saved and voted on how they should be given to contributors. So it's very common, for example, for a DAO to just give tokens away to people that show up and start helping. Like, hey, you did something here, and this is what Coordinate is used for. I know of 2 organizations right now that give away 1% of the equity every 2 weeks. And they use a Coordinate circle to basically distribute the equity of the company. So if you show up and start helping, and you're perceived to be adding value, you can right away have, power in decision making. And what are we doing, and where should we go next? And it's this ability to tokenize value and to say, I'm part of this. I'm part of this group. I can make decisions in this group. We can have different kinds of tokens, so we can tokenize value for ownership, or for governance, or for reputation. Like we've sort of just scratched the surface of what it means to try and bring a lot of the qualitative things that we have in the real world, and start to actually be able to hold them and show them and compare them. Obviously, that's a huge rabbit hole for how anything that you start measuring gets gamed, but that's going to be one of the next challenges for us to solve, I think, in the coming years. But this tokenization concept is extremely important, and that's another big draw why people want to join a DAO. It's like, I can have decision making power right now. Again, at Google, really hard for me to go in and say, I think we should pursue a car as a product, without a huge pile of shares. And that's something that can happen in DAOs.
Zach, I think this is a really good segue into Datis's question, if I'm pronouncing that name correctly. Apologies if I'm not. But even when you were talking about how tokens are granted, it sounds like there is some centralized component to a DAO that does have unequal power, but it also sounds like as you contribute more, you can get closer and closer to that without like going up the corporate ladder or playing politics or whatever it is that people need to do in companies these days. Is that the idea behind the first word in the acronym? Can you give us a little bit more about like what is it that makes a DAO decentralized? Because it sounds like there is a center.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, how I like to think about it is like instead of a pyramid, it's like a sphere, right? And there's always going to be people that are closer to that core. But the hierarchies are much more fluid than role-based, right? So, we used to say at Converge all the time, like the leader is the one who knows what to do next. And that was especially in the context of like complex facilitation when, things are happening in the room and it's like, you just have to trust each other and kind of roll with it. And in DAOs, this is what we see too, where because everything happens very transparently, generally speaking, and out in the open, it does take on, at least the DAOs that I've been a part of it does take on a real meritocratic flavor in terms of the people who are showing up and making proposals, and they're good proposals. You're like, this makes a lot of sense. I'll vote for this. And then they lead it because they have passion behind this project and they execute on it and it goes really well. They're going to get more credibility. They're going to get more allocation potentially of tokens, right? They're going to have more voting power, which means they may have more say in how the treasury is used. And so that decentralized piece is essentially that there is no gatekeeper in the DAO besides the governance. So that the governance is the central power. So for example, I might be in a DAO that says you have to have 10 people vouch for you before you can even join our Discord, our server. That's how our governance works. And another one is anyone who comes in can write a proposal. So very porous, like we're wide open. We love the chaos. And others are like, no, you can only write a proposal if you have 1,000 of our tokens. Like that's how our governance works. And so, and there's various ways to try and get those tokens. You can either just buy them or you can earn them. And so the decentralized part is that there isn't a gatekeeper that can just say, like, okay, this is over. Like when a CEO is just like, that project is dead. Like it's done. We're not spending any more money on that. It's like, well, hold on. The governance structure allows people to vote on things. And so it's decentralized in the sense that, and there's obviously a lot of different ways to handle that voting, but it's transparent, however it is. And I have to say, Julia, like, no, definitely not de-hierarchized organizations. We love the hierarchies. We just want them to be fluid, right? I don't want someone to make a decision because there's the VP. I want them to make the decision because everyone has seen that they have expertise and competency in whatever it is they're proposing. And so, hierarchies are like really important. And I don't think organizations can function without them. They just shouldn't be static, right? Just because I somehow found myself named the VP, that doesn't mean that I know the right thing to do or that I should have, that much more control over things.
That makes sense. That's fair. But I also think that decentralized is as big of a misnomer as de-hierarchized, but we don't have to necessarily go down that rabbit hole right now. I would like to invite you to share with us Coordinate and share what you've done there and what you're trying to do, because that is exactly what our share and listen or discussion portion is going to be focused on.
So Coordinate, I'm just going to share my screen and show you all quickly how this process works. And so real quickly, Coordinate is organized into circles. And circles are essentially who are the people that you've been collaborating with, and what budget or what resource are you trying to distribute. And so in this case, we have a group of people collaborating. Here's all of the people in the circle, and here I am at the top. And so I can share my contributions, right? This is what I've been I can share a broad headline, and then I can start. We just shipped this feature yesterday, so this is also good learning for me. These don't have paragraph breaks like I thought they were supposed to. But essentially, I can import here either with links from project management software or just longhand like I've done here. I can share all the things I've been doing over the course of this epic. So epic is just what is the length of time that we're reviewing for the allocations that we're making to people. So the circle is who am I allocating to, and the epic is over what length of time. And then you'll see here that I have 100 give, right? And as I distribute them, I use up my 100 to allocate. So the way that Coordinate works is that each of these people in the circle has 100 give. And the total amount of give equals the total amount of budget or resource that we are trying to allocate. So if we're trying to give out, $50,000 for this month of payroll, and I get 10% of all of the give tokens in the system, that means that I would get $5,000 paid out. And so I'm going to go through here and allocate to people according to what I think they've done. And I'm also going to leave them a note so I can look and see what their contributions are. And then I'm going to leave them a note to say like what I'm appreciating them for. And so I'm going to go through and allocate either until I am all out of give or until I feel satisfied with the amount of allocations that I've done. I'm going to hand them all out. And then when I'm done and I do all of my feedback and all of my allocations, what that looks like is it turns into this map so that I can see every person who they gave to, and I can see who they received from, right? So this person is receiving from all of these folks with green lines, and they gave to all of these folks with orange lines going out. So I can start to look and understand who are the people that are receiving a lot. What are they working on? What are they doing? So I can go back to their profile and understand their contributions and say, oh, wow, they're getting a lot for doing, whatever it is they're doing, shipping code or translating document, leading community walkthroughs, things like this. And so it creates a very low barrier to participation because someone can just show up and immediately start working and adding code. There's a lot more to say, but this is the basic idea is how do we, in a decentralized way, share resources and distribute them? Again, according to our idea is not to make this perfectly fair. I mean, that's a horizon we're heading toward. It won't always be perfectly fair, but how do we get closer to this ideal of value in equals value out? And I guess the last thing I'll say is one of the things that we're really building more and more toward in this product is the conversation is often even more valuable than the allocation. And so, we're consistently hearing from people like how much they love receiving the notes and writing the notes. And we're starting to now do some MVPs with folks that of actually doing retrospectives. So we found it's extremely powerful when we look at this graph together and, Loki has the chance to say like, well, yeah, I'm happy with what I got, but like, look how much DeFi Glenn got, why did they get that much? Or I feel like this wasn't fair. Why or why not? What do we value? What are we allocating for here? What is the rationale? And having those kind of sense-making conversations can be extremely valuable for all teams from my point of view. So I'll stop there and see, are there any questions from folks kind of around the basics of this?
How do you handle training on the tools and standards of the organization?
Specifically for writing code, organizations will have standards about like how you comment, how you declare variables, where do you check it in, where do you check it out, what are the testing tools? I mean, seems like there's a ramp for being able to do this. It's not as easy as just, you can show up and add code. Because that seems
Right.
kind of like,
Right. Code is probably the the worst example of people just showing up and starting to contribute. For us, and I think this is fairly common, is that what you'll have is some very easy kind of, very transactional basic tasks that people can come pick up and do. And if they do those, they can maybe take on something slightly more complicated. And so we kind of on-ramp folks that way, but it's a very, the code maybe, you're right, is not the best example because people are much more particular about that. It's more, for coders and developers, this acts more like a hiring funnel, wherein that you have kind of low, easy tasks ready for people to do. They do those, they can get paid for them right away through this allocation. And then if they stick around and they show up and take on something more complex, like great. And if they keep showing up and keep doing well and keep getting more and more complex tests, like you just found yourself a good developer, Yahtzee is kind of how several folks are using this. It's sort of a mutual tryout, where I can come and get compensated right away, but there isn't a lot of expectation or pressure on either side.
and there's a discoverable list of projects that people can jump on. Like,
Right. It
how
really
do I know?
depends on the scale of the DAO. Yeah. I mean, some DAOs right now have like 40 PRs that are just like kind of more bounty style. So it's like, we'll pay this much for this. And you can go get going that way because we're smaller and we can afford to be a little bit more bespoke. We don't do bounties. We just have people come join our community circle.
This map is making the system visible to itself in a beautiful way. But I'm curious if there's any downside to it. I can imagine that on the one hand, somebody can come look at a map like this and say, well, I don't know, Loki, whose name I adore and is the only one I remember. Loki is like doing so much, but it looks like they're already getting a lot of give, but maybe MA is, in my opinion, also doing so much, but not getting as much give as I think they deserve. And therefore I'm going to give them more.
Right.
But on the other hand, I can also imagine that having a map like this available can kind of encourage freeloaders, like give freeloaders, in the sense that they can look at this and be like, oh, cool, everybody's giving Loki give. That must probably mean that Loki is doing a really good job. So I'm just gonna be really lazy about it and also just give them give. And then it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy rather than one that actually gets the thoughtfulness that it's meant to. Have you come across any such paradigm, and how do you prevent it?
We definitely have had all the human factors, right? So for sure, I'd say the most common one is actually even more so than the free riders. Like, oh, Loki gave me some give. I'm not actually sure what they did this epic. I don't know, like I never have talked to them, but it's weird. I guess if they gave me give, like I'll give them some give too. And so you can have a very unintentional sort of flattening of, everyone just feels socially indebted. And so everyone gives to each other. And the smaller the team, obviously, the more likely that can happen. And there's sort of, all of those social dynamics are totally present. The ways that we're thinking about it, I'd say there's 3 ways we're sort of trying to explore and address these kind of issues. The first one is just trying to really prep teams with better onboarding and better, for example, like agreement. So really understanding, like as a collective, when we allocate, what are we allocating for? Is it for very holistically, like all of the different things that they do and how they show up and my experience of them and the vibes that they bring? Or is it like, show me what you've shipped? All of these can be fine, but the most important thing is we all have a sort of a shared understanding of, generally speaking, what is our organizational philosophy on how we allocate. And then there's some things that we can do with the tool as well. For example, I think like any day, we're going to turn on the ability for the admin has all sorts of different things that they can do. And we may turn off the ability. So right now, as I'm allocating, I can go look at the map and see in real time, it sort of updates itself and I can see who's giving to who. But if we turn that off, and this is how we did Thunderdome initially, is like everyone kind of turns their cards over at once. So you would only be able to see the allocation when epic was complete. So it'd basically be blind. So that'd be a way to remove that social piece, you know. And then the last thing is something that we call strategies, but this is just, for example, Phoenix might be receiving way less because they're a back-end developer, right? And most of their work is not facing out in public. Whereas DeFi Glenn is doing project management and, you know, making memes and writing blog posts. And so there's a lot more visibility. So strategies are essentially a way to give role designations to people and say anyone with that role, you know, has this hat. So it's a smart contract. So we could say anyone with a back-end developer designation gets a 20% weighting on their give at the end of the epic. So there's a way to sort of make up for why someone may get less because of less visibility, but still adding the same value. So yeah, there's things that we're doing as far as features in the app to try and address that. Also make it easier for people to sort of engage in and make those agreements, while also recognizing that to some degree, there probably isn't a way to fully avoid the fact that, you know, humans are inherently social and political, and some amount of gaming will happen. I think a big question for us is what are the ways that we can anonymously sort of surface people's issues without it turning into, you know, a suggestion box, which tends to, in my experience, end up being pretty toxic. So yeah, great question. Like the real short answer is I'm not sure. We're trying some things, but it's inherently challenging.
Well, that's why you're here. We're gonna fix all your problems, Zach.
I appreciate it.
And by that I mean we're gonna have breakouts and talk about the application of a tool like this to our lives, to our organizations, be a little creative about it and see where we can get. I created a Google Doc where if folks are able to just like drop in notes on what you end up talking about, and the questions that we have as prompts for your discussions are what application or applications might a tool like Coordinate have in your life or in your organization? And then what obstacles do you see in adopting something like this? And what do you see as the benefits of adopting an approach like this? Have a discussion and see what bubbles up. You don't have to stick to these prompts, but see what comes up in your breakout groups, and whatever does, have a person volunteer to be a scribe. But yeah, let's come up with some wisdom for Zach and his application of Coordinate, and he's trying to humanize the DAO universe. I think it's time to go to your breakout rooms. See you on the flip side. We've got 15 minutes. All right. Welcome back, y'all. Is there anyone that is called to share what came out during your breakout session on DAOs, Coordinate, or otherwise?
I'm happy to kick us off. We started off by talking about, because we're all freelancers and contractors in the room, sort of some of the things like when you scope a project, you think it's going to go one way, and at the end of the day, the work wasn't quite delineated in the way you thought, or parts of the process that some people owned took longer than parts other people owned. And so this is kind of a beautiful tool to assist with evening that out. But we then got into talking about like what our questions are. The first one that came up is like, if someone has a major setback in their life for any reason, childcare, death, illness, all of these things that happen that we need stable income through, what happens when we're not able to contribute to a project for a couple months due to life circumstances? And does that mean that there's no give, and it creates a opportunity for a conversation among the team of like, how do we support one another as whole people? I think it has a lot of potential to support that holism piece. We talked about like, it really raises questions of what's our relationship to reciprocity and responsibility. I was really struck, Zach, by this part of like, we feel obligated to give to those who give to us, and like how many cultural and familial tendrils there are to that, and just the conversations about where we come from and what we're informed by. And we talked about too, this tool being really great. And of course, you know, this is coming from people who do coaching and consulting and facilitation work, but we were like, this is a great tool to accompany by some sort of education around, you know, emotional intelligence, self-awareness, like getting people into these conversations that are going to help them use the tool in a really good way. And also, you know, offering even like, we'll facilitate your, you know, your quarterly in-person gathering, and we will bring up topics that are relevant that we know are going to probably be, you'll be touching on just by using this tool. So I think those were a lot of the things that came up in our group.
I just want to address quickly the question of like, okay, so how does maternity leave work, or how does, how do life circumstances fit into this? And the short answer is like not very well. And that has as much to do with kind of this current state of maturity of DAOs. There's very few DAOs that are self-sustaining with so much revenue that they're, functioning like an organization, and they can do that sort of thing. It's a lot more of a band of people from all over the world that skew very young, and they're in a position for whatever reason to take on this risk of, there's a lot of people in DAOs that are working for tokens that may never be worth anything. That's kind of a part of what you get for being on the bleeding edge of, a technology and a sort of organizational paradigm.
Yeah, my room had a question about applicability of the tokens, the Ethereum, to paying one's rent. Like, how easily does that translate, and is it always translating?
I guess so. There's two kinds. Well, there's 100 kinds of tokens, but I get paid in stable coins. So stable coins are things like USDC or DAI, but they're pegged to $1. Essentially, you need to know that their value doesn't fluctuate. They can always be redeemed for $1. And there's services like I use Opolis, it's called. And they're essentially, have created this kind of workaround where I send them crypto and they send me a W-2. There's boring mechanics behind how they're able to do that. But there's outside the US, because the US is an atrocious regulatory environment that I won't go into now, but really bad. And so other places, there's a lot of options where you can essentially have a debit card where you send them crypto and they'll accept hundreds of different kinds of tokens, and you get a debit card that you can just spend. And then increasingly, I sold my car for Ethereum, and I bought a four-wheeler for Ethereum down here when I moved. And so, as it grows, you also have the ability, of course, just to get into like wallet to wallet transfers, which once you do that, you'll never want to deal with a bank wire ever again. It's like the simplest and easiest and cheapest way to do things. I'd say there's, much like everything else, there's emerging infrastructure. It gets a lot harder when you're getting paid in native DAO tokens. So these DAOs that have a future vision and they have a whole plan, but it's like working for equity in a startup. It's like, this may be real high upside, but if this doesn't work, this isn't going to be worth anything. Especially right now, we're in this sort of bear market where all the mania has died down and prices for all this stuff are down 80-90% for some DAOs to deal with.
Travis says, we were talking about in our group how decentralized finance is doing things that many banks charge exorbitant fees, and you can do much cheaper in DeFi.
Yeah, or orders of magnitude more efficient from a capital standpoint. The kinds of things that you in DeFi are, which is why regulators have the time, because the travel agents of the future, as they see the internet coming, that there's a very large movement about bankless, and there's a lot of middlemen that are going to get cut out blockchain technology that are very upset about it. Yes, and check out Bankless DAO. They are a coordinate power user. I just wanted to do real quick to talk about this. Somebody said as a talent management suite. So this is something we thought a lot about. Moshe and I were, when we were collaborating, thinking about this sort of deep strategy on coordinate, where is it going to go? I definitely think that is the nut to crack, is how are we providing sort of this social and relational lattice for people to be a part of. Oops, I said infrastructure, scaffolding. That's what I meant. A scaffolding for relationships to grow on. But that's definitely like, when we think about where we want coordinate to grow into, it's kind of like if we can do compensation, and then that has a lot of implications for reputation. So I was telling my group that we see already, and we think even more, that give is going to be one of the highest signal, like kind of one of the highest signal markers you can have, as our identities are built online. This is like a LinkedIn testimonial that actually has some stakes to it, that people actually paid you. And so that could really show, it's a real testament. And as we build that reputation piece, then looking at, okay, how can we actually, and never say HR for DAOs, because everyone's kind of allergic to the word HR, and for good reason, but there's still these jobs to be done that HR does, like professional development and professional growth, like feedback and performance management and performance reviews and offboarding and onboarding, all these things. And so that's kind of where we're hoping to grow into, is to serve that more relational piece.
I just had this thought where one thing about dollars is that every dollar looks exactly like the next. And one thing about tokens is that they don't. And I'm actually thinking, would it be possible for one organization to have multiple types of tokens or token colors? Like,
Oh, yeah.
they can be worth the same amount, but some are like, these are tokens that we're giving you because we support you as a human being and you are on sick leave. And these are tokens that we give you because you have contributed to the growth of our organization. And is that something that you're actively playing with, passively playing with?
I mean, in our initial designs for Coordinate, there were 3 kinds of tokens that you would give. So there's give, there was props, and there was care, I think. And so give was sort of like more competency based. Props was like, kudos and just blowing somebody up. And then care was like credibility and trust and sort of things like that. Issue, and I people can do this internally. You can make as many tokens as you want and have them for whatever you want and send them however you want. It's pretty cheap and easy to get a token contract. But what are they valued? What is their value outside the organization, right? So much like you could have internal script someplace, but then you go off base and none of these things matter. So internally, people may have all sorts of different tokens to signify different things, but then you're going to need to somehow turn them into something that interacts with the outside world, unless they're just reputational. So this is something else that we're playing with right now, is like during each epoch, you get one golden give that you can give someone. And that may turn into like an NFT that then they can, hold or share, but that's kind of like a special props for someone that you think like really did well. A lot of people are also thinking about like, how do you separate basically? So this may be a rabbit hole, but as DAOs were forming, their governance token also became kind of the economic thing that people were speculating on. And so this is akin to like, I could go buy all of the tokens, means I could buy votes essentially. And so there's a lot of people who are separating this governance from the sort of financial value. And so that if for example, if we're making revenue and revenue somehow accrues back to token holders in the form of, like a dividend type arrangement, like we want to keep that separate from actual governance and voting. And just, even though we're recording this, wherever it ends up, of course, I would never advocate for any token to be sold to accrue any value back to its buyer, because that would make it a security and that would make it illegal. And so we're definitely not in the security business here in DAO land.
Well, with that very ominous.
That's one of the really interesting parts of how DAOs are meeting various legal systems, because they really are, I think of it, it's really similar to the way that teal organizations are running up against these, orange structures. It doesn't fit, it's a round peg in a square hole. And for me, one of the exciting things about DAOs is there's no change management process. I don't have to convince the CEO to do anything. I don't have to change all of this inertia and hierarchy. You can spin up an organization of a bunch of like-minded people and it can be teal right from the start. And that's how it's constructed. And we're seeing the same thing metaphorically with the way that DAOs are just running into legal structures. And we have laws and regulations and courts and all of these things like have no idea what to do with these things. They're just, they're the future and they're running into the present.
I love that you mentioned that, like the difficulty of translating teal into orange structures, which is the context in which we are all existing. And there's also in teal just the fact of how we've all been socialized, right? And so we have these ideals of how to do it, and then the guy just doesn't want to give up his attachment to decision-making power, right? Like that's not the model, but he doesn't cooperate. So that was the very first thing I saw about this is how are you accounting for the humans are pesky element? I mean, is that what gets taken care of? And ensuring everyone's kind of getting on the same page with their personal growth, because this isn't separate from all of the neuroses that we're going to bring into our work setting.
Yeah, I guess like the interesting thing about DAO, so someone may not want to give up their power or decision make, it's the governance structures, like make it really easy for like the DAO to vote. Imagine you're in some corporate hierarchy and everyone knows that Steve, the VP of whatever, is like, and you could just all vote, we can't keep doing these things that he's doing. We're going to give that role to someone else and the delegate someone else, and that happens out in the open. So hopefully the ideal is transparency. Can we implement more? That doesn't mean it doesn't have the ability to totally devolve into political stuff just like any other human system could. There's no reason just because you have roles in voting and contracts, people can still again game those and be people with them. But hopefully it does add a layer of transparency and a layer of empowerment that allows people to do things better. I think that's that instead of creating teal organizations, they're often creating very green ones that of course like fail because it's in such a reaction to the orange. And so I hope as they mature, there'll be that integration of green and orange that will lead to that teal dream we're all pursuing.
I want to thank everyone, and especially the ACT for coming. I have no doubt that this document you all can do is going to spark some new ideas for Coordinate, and maybe in you as you look through it and see opportunities where maybe you hadn't seen before. With that, I'd like to hand it to Ed.
Thanks, Zach, for him coming, and Moshe, you coming as well. Everyone who came, hoping we can shepherd in more self-management, yet also navigate these shadow sides and keep in mind the holistically human along the way. Thanks for coming today, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.